First off, G6PD deficiency is also called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. It's a genetic mutation that essentially predisposes you to break down red blood cells at a higher rate than typical, but it also is a mutation that decreases your ability to remove xenobiotics, decreases your immune function, and decreases methylation, among other things. Xenobiotics are just toxins that we don't make in our own body. So things like sulfites and ammonia, we actually make those ourselves. So we have specific biochemical processes to get rid of those. Things like aluminum, we don't make that. So those have to go through a different biochemical pathway. So first, the genetics. G6PD is X chromosome linked. It's X-linked, which means it's on the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes, males have 1 X and 1 Y. The Y is what makes them a male. It is recessive, which means that to really cause a ton of problems, you have to have 2 mutations on the same SNP. Now, the carriers of this, which is when you just have 1 mutation on 1 SNP, those can be affected too. Usually you don't see symptoms as bad as when you have 2 as a female or 1 as a male, but those are typically harder to diagnose anyway because the symptoms are so light, like in my friend, that people don't think, oh, this is G6PD deficiency. She's, killing off all kinds of blood cells. We need to test her and make sure that her levels are okay. So like I said, females have 2 X chromosomes. G6PD is recessive. So if you have 1 on the female, you can have symptoms. If you have 2 on the female, you can develop a rare autoimmune disorder called Bridges-Good syndrome. It's essentially so your body does this really cool thing. It's called a respiratory burst. And essentially when it detects some pathogens in your respiratory system, it can make a lot of reactive oxygen species, so oxidants essentially, and it's kind of like bursts them at pathogens and it kills them. But women with 2 of these can't necessarily do that well, so they have a lot of, they can have some immune problems from it. So males, since they only have 1 chromosome, if they get one mutation, they've got it, which obviously isn't ideal. However, and we'll get to this in a second, this is seen a lot in Middle Eastern, African, Asian, and Mediterranean women and men, partially because they are partially protected from malaria, because the outside membrane of the red blood cells aren't super stable. They tend to burst before malaria can really replicate and take hold in the red blood cells. So these people don't get malaria as bad or as frequently, which is a nice positive if you're going to have to deal with this. So I will put the SNPs in the comments. I'll take a picture of this. Well, actually, I'll just post the link to this entire PDF that comes, if people have G6PD, they get this PDF to take to their doctor. I'll just post it. But essentially, if people want to listen to this and get out their genetics, there are 4 SNPs that can be affected. It is RS10502828. If you have an AA, you're affected, or an A is a male. If you have an AG, you're a carrier that can be symptomatic. You just kind of have to see. If you're an AG as a female, you're having children. If you have boys, kind of just watch it. Watch, especially when they're newborns, they can get really bad jaundice. So just kind of, keep it in the back of your mind and pay attention. The second SNP is RS10502829. GG is G6PD affected type A, might be benign, we're not entirely sure. And AG is G6PD type A or B, again, possibly benign. For that one, if you're a male and you have G, then you probably need to go ask your doctor for the full panel. RS725546664, AA is affected, AG is a carrier. This carrier state can actually have a really wide range of symptoms. People can go from not affected at all to almost affected as much as somebody who has both mutations. So just kind of watch that one. And again, for this one, A would be affected for the male. And then the last one is RS5030868. The TT is affected, or just a T for a male, and then CT is affected for women, or affected carrier, sorry, so just a carrier for women. Since G6PD is X-linked, it also most often occurs in males, but it can also occur in females too. Females are often have the less symptomatic G6PD, which is much harder to diagnose. And since I feel like women, especially mothers, are less likely to go to the doctor for shortness of breath, dark urine, yellowish skin, and shortness of breath anyway, fatigue anyway. So, especially that demographic, we need to get to them and say, hey, just check your genetics for this. It takes literally less than 3 minutes to check 4 S&Ps. If you don't know how to do it, just message me and I can do a video on how to check your own DNA. It's not hard. Because G6PD deficiency predisposes an individual to higher levels of RBC loss, red blood cell loss, it's important to know what red blood cells do. So red blood cells have hemoglobin at the core, which contains iron, and that's important later. But red blood cells essentially pick up oxygen at the lungs and take them to your cells. They also pick up carbon dioxide in your tissues that your cells have gotten rid of and take it to the lungs to get rid of it so you can exhale it. Everybody knows how important oxygen is, obviously. Anybody, especially with asthma, knows how little less oxygen it takes to cause a lot of issues. You can get dizzy just at a small reduced oxygen intake. So if you can imagine you're losing a ton of red blood cells, you could run into some serious issues. Each red blood cell is supposed to live about 100 to 120 days. So recycling through those, if they're going to live 120 days and they only last 30, then you can get into a major issue. The G6PD deficiency biochemistry, those with G6PD deficiency have a mutation in an enzyme in the pentose phosphate pathway. You don't have to remember that, but just remember kind of that it's important. So the job of the pentose phosphate pathway include making NADPH. Again, you don't have to remember that, but NADPH is insanely important, and I'll get to that more in a second. Pentoses, which are the 5-carbon sugars, and ribose 5-phosphate, which is needed for nucleotide synthesis, aka making DNA. Symptoms of G6PD deficiency, even though it sounds like you would know if you have G6PD deficiency, a lot of the times it's asymptomatic until you hit a trigger. A few days after a trigger, a few hours to a few days after a trigger, the red blood cells start to break down at a much higher than normal rate. And not only does that leave you with a shortage of functional red blood cells, but it's a holy mess to clean up. You don't necessarily usually clean them up in your red blood cell or in your vessels. You have to take them to specific places for processing, and that's a ton for your body to have to clean up. It's also compounded by the fact that G6PD mutations leave you less likely to be able to clean those things up, so it's kind of a double hit. Symptoms can be things like shortness of breath, fatigue, yellowish skin, dark urine, and anemia. However, things can get a lot worse than this. If they're not caught and treated, especially in newborns, jaundice can stick around for a really long time. If that happens, your bilirubin levels are going to get really high in a newborn. If they get too high, they can cross over into the brain and cause a lot of issues. Not saying that, you need to stick every kid under a billy light, but, definitely make sure that if they tell you to take your kid home and put them by a window or something, make sure that you kind of pay attention to that. And if their jaundice is sticking around for a really long time and they're trying to figure out what's causing it, maybe throw this out. Maybe say, can we test them for G6PD deficiency? Neonates, children, and adults can progress into hemolytic crisis, acute kidney failure, and diabetics can develop diabetic ketoacidosis. None of those things are fun, so if you can kind of catch them beforehand, that's fantastic. So what do? You avoid the triggers. The triggers can include, but are not limited to, infections. Just essentially anything can cause, your red blood cells to lyse faster than they should. Infections can range anywhere from the flu to the common cold. Stress can cause your red blood cells to lyse faster. Fava beans, which is kind of strange, in not all cases of G6PD deficiency, but some eating fava beans can actually be a trigger. It's called favism, and it's actually a certain gene mutation. Certain meds such as aspirin, anti-malarial drugs, and mothballs can be triggers. There are a lot of drugs that are bad for those with G6PD deficiency. There's a ton. I'll just link it in the comments. But the bigger ones are the sulfa drugs, which can be antibiotics or anticonvulsants, depending on where the sulfur is and what extra stuff is added. Acute kidney failure, methylene blue, henna, the skin dye, and high doses of IV vitamin C, which kind of makes me sad because that stuff is pretty effective. Treatment, as we all know, you can't always avoid a trigger, especially when one of those triggers is stress. But you have to be prepared to treat, lysing a ton of your red blood cells at once. Treatment includes trying to reverse the trigger. So if we're talking about infection, you want to, if you think that antibiotics or antivirals will help with it, then that may be something that you consider. If it's the drug, just a pharmaceutical drug, or even henna or mothballs or whatever that's causing it, your doctor may want you to pull the drug immediately. If it's something like stress, it's kind of funny, like to reduce your stress while you're in a hemolytic crisis. However, things like Tai Chi, praying, meditating, learning to say no is a hard one, but can really help. Please understand that while reduction of stress is very important, can lessen your crisis and can prevent future crises, you may need conventional medicine on top of that. So just don't think that I can go home and de-stress and I may be okay. In serious situations, you may need a blood transfusion. You're going to have red blood cells to carry your oxygen one way or another, and if you have to get that from somebody else so you can breathe, or you can actually get oxygen to your tissues, then that's maybe something that you have to do. As I have refused blood transfusions in the past, and I understand the risks, but when it gets too risky, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and do it. In newborns with severe jaundice, a side note and kind of a soapbox moment. In every single city I've lived in, and we used to be former Army, I've lived in 6 different places in the past 6 years. Every single place that I've lived, I've called either for myself or a friend, and every place has had a medical supply store within at least an hour that has had a Billy blanket. Now, my first baby went into one of those light boxes, and that's hard. That's hard on the baby, because if they cry, you have to pick them up and console them and put them back in the box. But it's also hard in breastfeeding relationships and the mother. Every single place that I've lived has had a medical supply store with a Billy blanket or a Billy onesie. Now, these are blankets or onesies that have lights in them. And you take the baby home with the blanket or the onesie that's delivered by the medical supply store, or you can go pick it up. And they not only seem to be more effective, in my opinion, because I've had multiple people, friends, clients use them, but it not only strengthens the breastfeeding relationship, but it's less stressful on everybody. You can be home, your kid won't pick up some infection from the hospital, and there's no reason for you to be there if baby is stable and just needs this bilirubin down. You still have to go in to get their blood checked for monitoring, and sometimes they have a light that they can shine on their skin that will actually test their bilirubin level, so you can call around and see if they have that. But getting babies out of hospitals should be a priority. And when those blankets are available, there's really no reason to push a baby in a box and possibly impact a breastfeeding relationship. And kids with G6PD deficiencies will have to have light therapy for a significant period of time. So that needs to be an option that's prioritized for these kids, in my opinion. Additional effects, and this is kind of where it gets fun. So that's kind of where all of the medical articles stop, is red blood cells, right? But because we know that G6PD deficiency is a metabolism error in that PPP pathway, we know what the PPP pathway is supposed to do. G6PD, the enzyme, is what's called the rate-limiting enzyme in that entire pathway. Rate limiting means that enzyme is the slowest enzyme. So if you can imagine that you have a big assembly line, right? And we'll just say that we are making tires, okay? Some guy has to give you the rubber and some guy has to give you the metal. And you put the rubber tire on the rim and then you give it to another guy to put on the car, right? So I'm the guy in the middle and I'm just really slow. Not only can these guys can make tires at a certain rate, they can make the rubber and they can make the rim at a certain rate, and that's fine. But I'm not gonna be able to pick that stuff up as fast as they're making it. So it's just gonna build up. And then on this side, he's just gonna have to wait for me. So when we talk about the rate limiting enzyme in a biochemical reaction, it means that whole pathway has to go as slow as I'm going because I'm holding everybody up. That's why MTHFR is such a big deal in the folate pathway, because it's the rate limiting enzyme step. And that's why G6PD is a big deal, is because it slows the entire pathway down. So then we ask, what does the pathway do, right? If the pathway is doing something insignificant, then it's not a big deal. However, this pathway produces NADPH. NADPH is a cofactor in a ton of biochemical reactions. It protects you from oxidants. It's really good about picking up oxidants and then delivering them when they need to be delivered, like in a respiratory burst that we talked about. It's really good at regenerating glutathione, which is your main antioxidant. If you could imagine having to make a new glutathione every single time you used them, you wouldn't be able to get much work done. So this guy, NADPH, will actually go and take the oxidants off of glutathione and put it on himself, and then glutathione is good to go on and do its job again. If you guys know, Tylenol depletes glutathione. These people need to stay away from Tylenol. Like, no joke. Unless they have a doctor who understands this biochemistry that says, I need you to take Tylenol, I would be terrified to suggest it for one of these people. Like I said, the NADPH kills pathogens in the respiratory system via respiratory burst. It essentially just steals all the oxidants and then bursts them at the pathogen, and they kind of die, which is really cool. It runs the MTHFR enzyme, so everybody knows how important MTHFR is. It's a huge deal. And NADPH is a cofactor. So if you don't have it, it won't work, which means your methylation pathway won't work. NADPH is also responsible for converting folic acid into biofunctional folate, which is tetrahydrofolate. And that's kind of one of the catch-22s about taking folic acid, is you still have to convert tetrahydrofolate through the MTHFR enzyme. So if you're taking all the NADPH for folic acid, you don't have a ton left for MTHFR. So that's why we tell you to avoid folic acid. It also helps, this is a big deal, the cytochrome P450 enzymes, whose job are detoxing chemicals and drugs and toxic estrogens and all kinds of that stuff. So it does a lot of work. G6PD deficiency increases what's called advanced glycanation in products. It's essentially when proteins and lipids get a bunch of sugars stuck to them, because you have so many sugars running around in the body. This is kind of what happens when diabetics don't control their hemoglobin A1C for a really long time, and just sugars start attaching to everything. This can cause, obviously, diabetes, atherosclerosis, chronic kidney disease, and Alzheimer's disease. G6PD deficiency might actually be why type 2 diabetes and hypertension, which is high blood pressure, occurs really high in the Afro-Caribbean population. But they're still kind of looking into that. So prevention, what do you do to prevent things from happening? You avoid the triggers, obviously, as much as you can. You know the drugs that you can or cannot take. You try to stay away from anything that adds pressure to the methylation pathway. The cytochrome P450 enzymes, or will use up your glutathione. So, just toxins. You try to stay away from anything that's inflammatory. So, essentially, drink clean water, eat clean, whole food-based anti-inflammatory food, stay away from inflammatory foods, stay away from chemicals and drugs that introduce a lot of xenobiotics at once, especially injections, because injections, you can't screen any of that out. So like if you ingest a drug, your body can partially decide what it wants to absorb and what it doesn't want to absorb. In injections, it's all or nothing. You don't have really that choice. Don't eat fava beans, obviously, right? If you've eaten them in the past and you're fine, then you may be okay. You may just not have that one genetic mutation in the G6PD deficiency mutations. But if you haven't, I wouldn't risk it. Make sure that your iron and your ferritin levels stay within range at all times. Iron deficiency anemia can cause you to have a lower amount of red blood cells anyway. So you really don't want to walk into a G6PD deficiency crisis with really low blood cells, red blood cells. You want to make sure that the red blood cells stay within the range because the iron and the ferritin are staying within range too. Because our methylation pathway is going to run slower because we don't have an ADPH as much, we want to make sure that we're getting enough folate, enough B2, enough B12, enough B6, and enough magnesium to kind of run the methylation pathway in the background. Try to see. That is, yep. That in zinc and chloine. So folate, B2, B12, B6, zinc and chloine, and magnesium. Just make sure you get your RDA. I'm not talking like take 6 times the RDA. Just make sure you get what you're supposed to get every day. Stay away from the sick whenever possible. Don't go out in large crowds if you know that there's flu. Everybody's got the flu in your town. Send somebody else out or do the Instacart or Kroger pickup or whatever you need to do. And then this is kind of a joke, but try to live as stress-free as possible. I know it's not necessarily going to work at all times, but you can try. So I'm going to read those RS numbers off again. I'm going to eventually re-record this and upload it to YouTube, so it's just all together and you don't have to hunt for all the videos. And let me know if you have any questions that I can address in the YouTube version of this one. So RS 1050828, AA is affected. A is affected if you're a male. AG is affected. AG is carrier. RS 1050829, GG is G6PD affected type A, possibly benign. G would be affected type A for males. AG is G6PD type A or B, possibly benign. RS 725546664, AA is affected. A would be affected for males. AG is a carrier with very variable symptoms. It could be nothing. It could be, almost just as bad as affected. And then RS 5030868, TT is affected or just T is affected in males, and then CT is the carrier. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to do the MTHFR video next week. That will take probably about 4 hours to go through all of that stuff because it's a lot. And then after that, the next week will be BCMO1, which is your vitamin A, beta carotene to retinol palmitate. Okay? Thank you guys so much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.